It's Thabo Dimema, but his surname is spelled and it starts with an L-I. So Thabo, if you'd like to just share some of that exceptional wisdom of yours to our audience, that'd be great.
Look, I think firstly, thank you for having me. I
Yes.
appreciate the opportunity to come
Thanks,
here
man.
and
No,
engage.
thanks.
I
Thanks for
listened to your
coming.
first episode. I wrote on the comment. I'm like, you know what? The things that you guys are talking about are actually very important, and I'd like to be a part of this conversation. So I think for me is just to speak, my mind, speak from the heart, have authentic conversations with people that live in a country that they care about, that they love. I think there's a lot of things we have in common.
100%.
Often the country focus too much on the divisions, but less on the things that bring us together. So that's the theme for today. On your note, Stefan, so my surname L-I, and L-I in Sesotho is pronounced D. Now you may have seen some people with names Lipalesa or Likeledi or Mupeli. The L-I is actually a D there because the history of the pronunciation comes from Lesotho. So my family is originally from the Kingdom of Lesotho. The Kingdom of Lesotho was heavily influenced by colonizers, different colonizers. So the British were the main ones. So if you've looked, the King of Lesotho, for example, was at King Charles' coronation. There's a history where Princess Diana has come to Lesotho, her children, even Harry's been to Lesotho fairly recently, right? So there's a history for the British, but also the literature of the Basotho people are also heavily influenced by the French. You write an L, there's an I, there's a friend of mine, her name is Tisetso. She still insists to write the L with the kapi with the two, little dots at the top and to add the. So all of that are things that are influenced by people that came into the country and taught people how to read and write. And just the way we say things is heavily influenced by a diversity of people from different backgrounds. So I think it's a rich thing to also talk about because our writing is influenced by people that are different to us, but we've accepted that and it's part of who we are. And another story, I know you didn't ask me this, but I'll volunteer it. If you look at the Basotho blanket, let's say Siana Marena, you will see the blanket has like yellow colors. Let's say it's a blue blanket, which is what the color is. Got a bit of black, it's got a bit of white, but the yellow marks on that blanket were actually a manufacturing fault.
Oh my
They
goodness.
took it to be manufactured, and when they presented it to the king, it had these yellow lines,
Wow.
and it was a manufacturing fault, and the king said, you know what? Keep it. I like it as it is because it symbolizes that we are imperfect, we are people, and let's keep this throughout the times when we make these blankets because humanity is not perfect.
How
So
cool is
Wow,
that?
that's
an
a beautiful
interesting
thing.
point there to add to the
That's
history of the
super
Basotho
cool.
people, but yeah.
Well, that adds towards our conversation we're gonna have tonight.
Yeah.
So
That definitely sort of, I think, affects our influx here. So maybe let's touch on something that you mentioned there. And it's because we're obviously going to talk about entrepreneurship and actually breaking the back of poverty and things like that. But I think moving towards that, right? I think you mentioned the kingdom of. Wait, I'm
Lesotho.
confused. The kingdom of Lesotho,
Yes.
right? You mentioned the kingdom
The
of
mountain
Lesotho.
kingdom, as it's
Yes,
colloquially
and
known.
then 100%, and then the touch on colonization and all of those things, and then obviously now this beautiful story with regards to the blanket. So I think maybe a great introductory question would be, off the bat, is how do we keep the beautiful parts of our heritage, right?
Yeah.
And move on from the tougher parts of our heritage and actually move forward, because I mean something like that definitely is valuable, in terms of our heritage, right? And I mean it's a beautiful story, and I think as Africans and the South Africans, irrespective of your color, your religion, or whatever, you feel something when you hear a story like that. Point being, there are beautiful parts in terms of our heritage. Obviously, there's a very difficult part in our heritage. So how do we sort of keep what we want, what we need to keep, right? And what do we need to keep? And how do we actually maybe move forward and away from the things that we should move away from them if we indeed need to?
Look, I think that's a very interesting question. So I think the context that I want to add to that question is at an individual level. Because who you are, like my priest used to say, we are the sums of our yesterdays and products of our choices. Everything that has made you who you are today is as a result of both good and bad experiences. So all of that are things that are responsible for ultimately how you guys are showing up today and how I'm showing up. So I would say with regards to the history of the country, the history of the continent, because Africa did suffer a lot
Yes.
in the periods of colonization. I don't think it's good to glorify colonization because it hurt people. It created a lot of resentment that still lives today. And there's things that came from colonization that are scars that many people carry, even in countries that benefited from it, like in the United States, for example. They celebrate Black History Month in February, and they talk about how they don't know their roots because they were taken away and literally ripped from their umbilical cords, which is their motherland. So there's still pain that's not experienced by us here, but people elsewhere that are part of the diaspora. But I think it's important not to, as I said, the past that we inherit has both good and bad. The fact that you and I can have a conversation today, that's good.
I
Because
agree.
there's communication, there's
100%,
engagement.
yes.
Someone had to teach a person how to converse in a particular language. I could literally sit here and say, "Dumelang ke nna Thabo Dimela." Like,
Understood the first part, right?
yes, you know Dumelang, right?
And to be fair,
That's where it
which
stops.
in its essence is a bit of a problem.
Yeah,
And we can
yeah,
attend to
yeah.
that.
It's a problem in itself, and we can attend to it later, and I'd like to do that. But I think the importance of building bridges of understanding
That's it.
as opposed to barriers of misunderstanding is a lot more constructive in getting us to move forward as a collective, as a
I agree.
people. So I think the history we have, the fact that some of our people can go to other countries and see something, even though the colonizer country had some evil stuff, they can go there and say, I can relate to that because I've seen it back home. You know, I've seen a beret worn by my auntie. Now I see a French guy walking in the street wearing a red beret, playing an instrument that I've heard back home. So I think while, you know, today we celebrate globalization, a lot of it came in the time when colonization starts and we started learning about each other. Power dynamics, obviously, and other human features took over. Greed, lust, envy, all the things that made the pain what it was, which is human nature and I guess part of the deadly sins. I think the things that we celebrate today about humanity are things that we can definitely learn from in our history as
Agreed.
a country, as a people. And yeah, I'd say the trajectory of the world is towards good, in my view.
I agree.
If I look at humanity, how we converse, how we speak to each other, how we relate, today, I mean, I was watching a Shaka series the other day, and they were literally putting guys, taking them on a boat, kicking them. Black people were enslaving other black people and throwing them on ships. At that time, that was okay because that was trade. There was a commodity, there was a person, there was a good
Well, that was
property.
what they knew. So
And
that
that was for them at the time. This is our job. This is how I make a living to feed my family. But today, if someone does that, it's wrong.
Yeah.
So I'm just using those two examples to show how
it's the extremes,
we
but it's the
define
easiest way
things.
to draw the line.
The interesting thing for me though is what is it that we're doing today that generations down they'll say that was bad. I can't believe my great grandparents used to do
Yeah,
these
no,
kind
I
of
get
things,
you.
you know.
Yeah.
So yeah,
That's a tough thought.
And for me, and it's really for us getting to a common thing where we can, because we need to have unity and we need to strive towards that unity. And one thing for me is, because I believe, and I'm not 100% sure when you watch that, the video of Shaka, King Shaka.
Ilembe.
Yeah. Surely there was a huge language barrier then. So there wasn't a common language in the sense of English, and everybody spoke English proper.
Yeah.
Because I know the Afrikaner didn't want to even speak English because
Yeah.
that was, you know, the foreign language.
Yeah.
And obviously the Zulus, and so the language barrier only, I think, would have been one of, and it's something that I just thought of now, but that's maybe one of the huge issues why there was never maybe common ground, because they couldn't communicate with each other.
Yeah, and to a
usually
large
they had
extent.
talks and stuff, I assume. Not 100% sure on that, but the thing is they couldn't sit down like this and have a proper conversation because of, you know, so I believe the language barrier could be something.
yeah.
But
Well, let's touch on that, right? Because
Yeah.
I mean, because you did mention it, and I mean, because I'm going to be honest. Listen, I think there's a bit of a challenge with that today as well.
no,
you know.
there is.
And I'll tell you why. Well, I mean, for me, I sort of decided, listen, I wanted to at least start learning isiZulu, right? But I don't know why that was my starting point, but I thought this is where I wanted to start, right? So I actually got a tutor, started with the tutoring classes.
Yeah.
And I mean, two things, like, right, still committed, to learn the language.
Yeah.
Not that easy though.
Yeah.
So now I'm sitting at 34 years of age, right? And I'm giving my best because I'm trying, but ultimately it's not that easy. Here's the question that I wanted to ask, right?
Yeah.
Do you think that it's actually worthwhile across the board for all, let me say, African/South Africans, right, to actually go that route? Or do you think we just go with English because that's sort of the whole globalization picture, and we've got AI that's going to remove language possibly?
Yeah.
It's an
Yeah.
honest question.
Yeah.
No, it's a fair question.
You know, I think it's definitely struck a nerve in Parliament.
Yeah,
know?
yeah. That's fair. Look, first of all, our mother tongue's not English.
Yeah. No.
You guys are Afrikaans,
Yeah,
ke
sure.
Mosotho,
Yeah.
and we had to find a language that allows us to converse,
communicate,
for
yeah.
instance,
Yes.
right? So I think from that perspective, there is value in having a language that can create commonality in sharing concepts, etc. But even within the same language, there's a misunderstanding because language is only a medium of communication,
Yeah.
but the intent is very different
I get you.
in different contexts. Culture, how we say
No,
things.
that's-
You know, when I say something, I look at you, those sort of body language and other facts of communication. But I am a believer, before we speak about what you're asking me, in preserving indigenous languages.
Okay.
I think people that speak Sesotho should strive to preserve their
Yeah.
languages. Zulu people, I like that Shaka Ilembe is in Zulu and they speak beautiful Zulu. And their kids can watch that and be like, wow, that's me.
I
there.
agree, yeah.
And they see themselves. Afrikaans, things like, obviously the history of the country has a lot of pain around, you know, apartheid and the things that came there. And as a result of that, there were institutions of higher learning that were very Afrikaans focused. The unfortunate thing, in my view, is now when you want to break those institutions down and remove the benefit they come with for a community that speaks that language, as opposed to saying, how do we build Sesotho academic content?
Yeah.
How do we build Zulu, Xhosa,
Yeah.
Venda, all the languages, and have those institutions serve the country in a way that represents the demographics of the country, right? So my take on the language thing is preservation is important, especially as I believe it's getting diluted. My Sesotho today is not as good as my
That's it.
grandfather's
I get you.
Sesotho.
Yeah.
So
No,
that worries
it
me.
gets slangish.
So when
Well,
I
the
was
same
saying
with
to
our
you,
Afrikaans, right?
Yeah.
when I was telling you about the future, what our kids are gonna say, they're probably gonna judge us on how badly we preserved our languages.
Yeah.
But I digress. Let me come to your question. I think it's very important for people to be able to engage. I think Nelson Mandela had a very nice quote around this because if you speak to a person in their natural language, you speak to their heart. It shows that you've made an effort to try and communicate them in a way that values their humanity and values you see them, and you've actually made an effort
Yeah.
to
Because
engage
you know
them
it's not
where they
easy
are.
to learn
It's
it,
not
so-
easy, bro. Like
Yeah.
even with me, dude. Like I tried to learn a bit of French when I was going to stay in Mauritius. On
Yeah,
my,
no,
you know,
that's-
I was
yeah.
telling you I was there for a little
Yeah,
bit.
yeah.
I traveled Europe. I try to learn basic words to introduce myself to some, you know, a waiter. You know, je m'appelle Tabo, et toi, un vin rouge, s'il vous plaît. Like, and people really like that.
Of course.
So it speaks
Even
to a
though it
person's
was
heart.
just maybe the
I
basics.
broke it, by the way. I didn't care about my pronunciation because the problem with
The Zulu come in a little bit.
countries like France, if you speak English, they don't like that because there's a bit of tension between the French and the English. And when they gave me that, I responded in Sesotho. And I said, well, if I speak my mother tongue, I know you know, so
But the intent was pure.
the intent was pure, but I think
goodness.
if you make an effort to understand and learn a
dude.
person's language, it shows that, man, I'm really trying hard to build bridges here.
No, that's for sure.
Not
That's-
impose my language and expect you to respond without me trying to meet you halfway.
Yes.
Listen, I saw that firsthand. My father can speak, most of the languages. He speaks Sesotho, like really well. He grew up in the Brits area, Fontaine area. So he grew up, you know, speaking Sesotho. And he learned obviously the other languages. But I saw firsthand how that just him speaking and communicating to people in their mother tongue. How much more respect just towards both parties.
Relationships.
It's
trust.
super.
It's the first building bridge of any relationship. Trust.
that's-
If you speak my language, maybe you're on my side. But what have you got to say?
Yeah.
You know?
Well, it's just that barrier to break through
Yeah.
that barrier to be able to communicate. Because yes, and I cannot remember the saying, but I quoted it the other day. But it comes down to you cannot. There's the willingness to listen, otherwise you're not going to be able to hear. So if you've got the guard, you won't be able to hear whatever somebody's communicating. And it's almost like what we're coming down to now is that the communication thing, and this is something I do understand the importance of it, but it's something that maybe, because listen, we after unity. We want to get to the unity thing.
Yes.
And if it takes us to 4,000 guests, so be it.
Yeah.
But we're going to run for that unity thing and, build and you'll hear us mentioning this so that we can drive, the conversation totally and constantly towards that, because I believe there will be that one thing that we're going to get to, even if it's the language or the communication thing, because communication are super. The message to get your message across, and to have your, because nobody do something purely out of a bad intent the whole time. You cannot be. I don't believe everybody, no matter who you are, listen, in the political game.
Unless you psycho and you.
But you cannot have a bad intent purely. But it's how you come across. What's that pure intent that you come across with, and the communication with, and that to actually express what you're feeling. And
true.
sometimes people, when they, not to say uneducated, but if they weren't, educated to communicate well, that could be something difficult to express. And then it comes out within some actions or whatever, and then we sit on the other side, or you sit on the other side, and now there's a big fight or whatever. I don't want to go into specific things, but that could be some of the issues. Because,
Well, I'll say at the least, I think it's maybe a very good starting point. At least one of the starting points, but something to really consider.
Yeah.
Because I do think that it pulls the heartstrings, at least as a starting point, when you're going to have the conversation. Ultimately, I think all of us understand that actions speak louder than words.
Yeah.
But if it's backed by a common language or the ability to actually communicate well, that certainly carries some value.
So maybe let me ask you something.
Shoot for the moon.
Die volgende keer ek kom hierso, ek sal gesels met julle in Sesotho en ek sal vra, hoe gaan dit? Is dit maklik?
And we need to be able to respond.
En
the challenge is
exactly.
that ons Zulu bietjie praat.
Yes.
Well, suit you, right? But listen, to be fair, let's take up that challenge, right?
Yeah.
I think it's a fair
challenge.
challenge, right? Okay, let's maybe look to the future a bit.
Yes.
Yeah, so listen, Thabo, obviously you are super passionate about about a lot of things, but I think the best starting point for us is going to be the skills that are required for the future world.
Yeah.
And South Africa and Africa obviously's current position in terms of this, and how do we progress in terms of the skills that are required for the future economy, right? You're welcome to share your thoughts on that, and I think then we can move in that direction.
Yeah. Look, as I said, the skills that made people successful a decade ago, a century ago, are very different. So the only constant in our ability to be relevant is change, and we need to be adaptive. But adapting is something that is very uncomfortable to many people, and they'd rather stay in the, very cozy area. But when you talk about the future, you actually start seeing aspects of that show themselves today. The geopolitical issues that happen between the US and China and many other things that affect us, right? And if I can use a skill as an example, when President Xi Jinping spoke at the BRICS summit last year, he said one of the things that they want to start exchanging information on and intelligence and skill is around artificial intelligence. I know we were speaking about AI earlier, but everyone knows that China is one of the most highly educated countries. They are very intentional. And the beautiful thing about China is that they teach their people in their language. They teach people in Mandarin. And so they do things at the core based on what they understand. Whereas countries like South Africa, we teach people, most of the country is not English, by the way, right? So you teach them in a language where they have to firstly bridge the language barrier and then learn and then apply that learning in a context that makes sense. So I think there's a lot of work that we need to do from a skills of the future perspective to think around how do we use the very AI we're talking about to then start translating certain aspects of education into vernacular languages that people can understand.